It started with 2 weeks of utter madness. Innocent lives were lost, including a child that choked to death from tear gas fumes. The scale of injuries was alarming as it was indiscriminate. Reporters and camera persons were not spared. The opposition called it mass action protests, and with it came blood, tears, pain and loss. And loss hit an unlikely address as a Zimbabwe-like invasion of private property played out in Northlands, the vast farmland associated with the family of founding President Jomo Kenyatta and fourth President Uhuru Kenyatta. Then, typical of the Kenyan script, talks have begun angrily as political players snarl ahead of talks that could lead to talks about talks. At this early stage, the word on the street is bipartisan. But just how bipartisan is bipartisan? We introduce some sense about that as Gituku dissects the age of our leadership. Jamila's memo is post-dated defense of the media. Kaikai's kicker invites Ugandan General Muhoozi Kainerugaba to give the rye. And my take, we are better than this, Kenya. The News Gang is back.
As a believer in running an accountable government, our position is that we should never be in the position that this country was put by the handshake, where there is no distinction between government and the opposition. Once you compromise accountability and oversight, you are in for a lot of trouble. Our position is that we want to engage our brothers and sisters on the other side on issues that are important to the people of Kenya, them as an opposition, us as a government. That way, the system of checks and balances remains intact.
That, lady and gentlemen, was Sunday. The much-needed voice of the president to give a way forward or resolve the crisis that had taken place for 2 weeks. But that came after, quite some 2 weeks of something interesting. But Jamila, maybe you can take us through what happened leading up to Sunday, and indeed what's happened since Sunday, because things then evolved pretty quickly after that, right?
Yvonne, leading up to Sunday, I think by Sunday morning, we were planning how to cover the Maandamano.
By Sunday afternoon, remember the meeting we had?
We had a meeting just planning how we're going to cover this, because we're expecting on Monday, we're going to witness what we had witnessed for 2 consecutive Mondays, which were the running battles, the Maandamano, and all that came with it, including businesses being affected, lives being lost. We spoke about it, injuries, and all that happened with the Maandamano. And we expected it. And then, of course, the message comes that there's a press statement there's a presser by the president from State House in the afternoon. And then shortly after that, of course, when we went and he spoke about how he was asking the Azimio leader to stop the Maandamano, which had really brought the country to a standstill for 2 weeks, Yvonne, in terms of how the first Monday was when we had the first Maandamano and how businesses were affected in the city center because the protesters were able to get in. And then now, I think because of the successes, I think if you look at it from the Azimio point of view of the Maandamano on Monday, on day one, they decided, well, we're going to have it now twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, because what they'd wanted to achieve had been achieved in terms of paralyzing business in various parts of the city, and of course in Kisumu and other parts of the country where the Maandamanos did happen, Yvonne. And it was difficult for a lot of people. Even for us as the media, we witnessed attacks on our colleagues, both from state and non-state actors, and then looking at their lives lost. And then having it twice a week was really something that many were not looking forward to. But you see, there were these demands that were being made by Azimio as to why they were having the Maandamano, the cost of living, and of course, opening of the Sava and all that. But for most people, really, it was that issue about the cost of living. We had the Maandamanos with sufurias in the head. Of course, today the president said he's a sufuria would not bring down the cost of living. But Yvonne, what we saw as a country for 2 weeks was really, really difficult. And I think despite the effects it had and the fact that Raila Odinga and the Azimio team was getting the attention they wanted, and the fact that now it was not just here in Kenya because of it was being watched internationally, even had the international community, the EU speaking about it. The fact that the president on Sunday spoke and said, I'm asking you to stop with the maandamano and then we can start talking. And then, of course, Raila having his press in the evening and saying, well, we can stop for now, he said, for a week, until we see the issues we want, was really a huge sigh of relief, Yvonne. But now, talks, bipartisan, tunakutana, tukutani, we'll talk more about it, but that's what has led us to this point.
Yeah, and it was all about wanting to hear the voice of the president. You know, Sam, you'd hosted quite a few shows in the morning, and I remember many of your panelists saying, it's only one person who can, you know, sort of resolve this stalemate after 3 days of protests. So that voice was very much needed, and it came, and, you know, here we are.
Yeah, you're right, because I remember the weeks leading to the mass demonstrations, and even within those 2 weeks, speaking to various leaders, and everyone was an extremist when they come to the show. They tell you reasons why they think an attack happened at a certain private property. They tell you why they think this is the only way, this is the only language that the government of Kenya Kwanza administration, rather, will understand. And this was at a time that the religious leaders had spoken. Everyone, remember there was a meeting between the religious leaders and the team of Raila Odinga on Wednesday evening, but they couldn't agree to stop the protests of Thursday. But also the events of Thursday last week, I think for me, was the turning point for this entire drama, allow me to use that word, because it was destructive in a lot of ways. Journalists were injured, property was destroyed. The leaders themselves from the Azimio side were either injured or their vehicles was destroyed, and it was really, I think it was the most painful thing for them to see that day, even watching the NA Kenya party leader, Martha Karua, even saying that she was going to sue Japhet Koome in person, as a person, the Inspector General of Police. But then at such a time, then there was a meeting on Saturday, if you recall, it happened, was it in Malava?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talk that was going on there. I mean, there was no climbing down. It was saying that let them come on Monday, they'll see what will happen. So we were at a point that we needed a reason, the voice of reason. And I think whether they agree that there was a meeting between the president and former prime minister or not, that was a voice that was very necessary. But I think also because the president had been away for a couple of days, it was also that expectation that all this, allow me again to use madness, it had to stop. And everyone was looking at the president because that is where the buck stops. So that statement really on Sunday, and 2 hours later by Raila Odinga, really for me, was the turning point. But then again, the events that have happened since that time, then it shows you that everybody needed a reason to stop the demonstrations.
Yeah, and you know, you talk about that meeting in Malava. That was where, was that where we heard that the government will, you know, assert its authority.
Yes.
Right. And so you're right, there was just, everybody was, you know, not climbing down. And I remember even when we were covering the Monday protests, now, you know, that was the week when we had 2 protests in that week. And it was, you know, you get to a position where everybody was saying, look, this is the stand we're taking. And there didn't seem to be a de-escalation. And I remember the conversations we were having on air at the time was, what will it take to bring this down? And everybody said it was the president. And so finally he spoke. But then Linus, after he did, so now we're doing a lot of talking. I guess talking is good, but we're talking about how we should talk. How, where we should talk, what we should talk about, how we should talk about it, who should be seated at the table. There's lots of talk in the country. You know, it's probably a better place than where we were 2 weeks before.
And I tell you what, that is exactly how it's supposed to be. We have to talk about talks and talk about talks that will then hopefully lead to talks about more talks. That is the nature of the space we have now entered. We have entered the space of a peaceful resolution to a conflict. And you know there are only 3 methods that you can use there. One is negotiation. Another one is mediation. Another one is arbitration. You see, what the president chose on Sunday is under the category of negotiation. Because what this means, he said, go to Parliament. You're going to discuss this as a bipartisan issue between the Kenya Kwanza administration and the Azimio la Umoja opposition. And that is then introduces the negotiation where these two parties will actually sit, or should actually sit, across the table and directly talk to each other about what the issues are and agree to disagree on what the issues are. So this is negotiation. It will involve the two sides and nobody else. And the president said, take the parliament route. We said bipartisan and parliament. And then why it will be talks about talks and it could even last longer than we actually projecting is because at this stage, we have only one issue that has been identified, and that is the issue of the IEBC.
Yeah.
So what is the process being followed on the issue of IEBC? We're talking about the selection process that the opposition Azimio la Umoja coalition had disputed.
Yeah.
So when these parties meet, and we saw today Azimio la Umoja named seven of its members that will negotiate. On Tuesday, we expect Kenya Kwanza to meet and name the 7.
Yeah.
When these two meet, they'll say, okay, what is at issue? We agreed as per our side, that's Kenya Kwanza, that there's only one issue, that of IEBC.
Yeah.
Let's discuss that. So, and then there'll be a counter argument from the Azimio la Umoja side. And then they'll probably say, yes, that is the issue, but, and we want to take into context what the conversation has played out for the last few days. And that is clearly the desire on the part of Azimio la Umoja to expand this to be more than just about IEBC. It should also be about other things. What we've had cost of living, I don't know how that will play out. And then other issues will also emerge. Now, do we expect this to actually start and end as a bipartisan 7 one side, 7 on the other side process? We do not know. We do not know. And one of the things that should really be clear among, especially for Kenyans, is this is not a rallies thing anymore. Once a negotiation process begins, it's a boardroom matter. Select your 7, select, let the other side select their 7, take them to a room, and they're going to talk between the two sides. They're going to agree or they're going to disagree. If they disagree, what happens? Then it can go to the second form of the conflict resolution, which will be mediation. Get an independent party to come and sit between the two sides and say, okay, what do you have to say? And what do you have to say? What do you have to say, Kenya Kwanza? What do you have to say as Azimio la Umoja? Will it go to that stage? Yes, it will have to go to that stage if negotiation doesn't work. If the 7 from Azimio and the 7 from Kenya Kwanza can't agree amongst themselves. So we are in interesting times. But here is something that is really misleading about our political players. Look at what they've been doing for the last few days. They've been pretending to offer and reject. What are you offering and what are you rejecting? Nothing has started until the 7 from Azimio and the 7 from Kenya Kwanza actually sit in a room and say, this is the structure. Right now, there's no structure except for the speech by the president and the counter speech from the Odinga side, which he called a counter offer. So, but look, we are Kenyans. Look at how much noise we can make, how many road shows we can do out of nothing. It's very actually amusing to watch that we're arguing about nothing.
And Yvonne,
because nothing has started yet.
And as we talk about there being nothing yet, today, of course, at the meeting of Azimio where they named the 7, they came up with a list of demands for the talks, the terms of reference, and Linus alluded to them, other than, of course, recommending the measures to lower the cost of unga, fuel, electricity, and school fees. Okay, that's
that's a new one. We hadn't heard school fees before, have we?
In it.
It had been there very early, way before a decision to have mass action. It was there at some point.
But it's back now again. Conduct a review and forensic audit of the servers used by the IEBC before, during, and after the 2022 presidential elections. Review the appointment and dismissal of IEBC commissioners, including their tenure of office, and recommend institutional policy, legal and constitutional mechanisms, restructuring and reforms of the IEBC. They go on to talk about restructuring of the IEBC by devolving structures to the counties. They go talking about how they want the Cherera 4 to be reinstated. Goes on talking about reviewing and recommending changes in the law that will entrench party discipline and fidelity. And they give four conditions of how they want that done. And then they say the Joint Task Force shall present its report to Parliament within 30 days of the establishment. That was today. And then, of course, Linus is talking about how there have been a lot of talks in the past few days from majority leader, minority leader, Senate minority leader, Senate majority leader. And maybe we can listen to a couple of them. Aaron Cheriot, speaking about between Ichung'wah and I, we are ready. Can we listen to that soundbite?
So I'd wish to remind the country that as a majority side in Parliament, we are willing and ready. We are waiting for the formation of this committee. We hope that as soon as the minority side are ready, I tried to reach out to them yesterday. They said they were still waiting for instructions from their party leadership, and I think they have a parliamentary group meeting later on tomorrow, after which they will be ready to engage with us as Parliament. Well and good. We'll come, sit, but everything will be guided within the confines of law. And that is what we agreed. We don't expect them to keep on changing goalposts as they have done.
That was yesterday. The meeting happened today with Azimio, and of course the 7 were named. And next week we expect Kenya Kwanza's PG on Tuesday, and they'll have their 7. But the president today said it's Parliament or not. And it's because I think of what Raila Odinga yesterday, talking about how he wanted almost something similar to what was in 2008 with the National Accord with former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan after the 2007-2008 post-election violence. But then now the president saying, no, we're only doing the parliamentary way. And it should be it will be interesting to see how this goes forward now. Not even don't talk about even Tuesday, between now and that Tuesday, because we'll have pronouncements after pronouncements from these leaders in terms of this is what we want, this is what we don't want, this is what you want. So by the time they get to that table and talk, there'll be a lot that will have been said, which I fear will, my concern is it will compromise already, or really influence already, even before they sit down and start talking.
But you know what's interesting is that even as they're forming their 7-person team that will engage in this bipartisan, approach or negotiations or talk, they're still not trusting that bipartisan process. I believe they said, Martha Karua said today, let us not hide behind Parliament. The Speaker cannot be in charge. So there's... here we are forming these committees, we are forming these teams, but we still do not trust the process. But Sam, it's also about, what they say, when we talk about what issues might end up being on the table. For now, it's been identified as the IEBC and that process, and we'll speak about that in a minute. But, you did hear the president on Sunday talk about the memoranda that he had sent to Parliament before. Right. I think he was trying to address some of the issues in a manner to say, look, hey, a lot of what you are lamenting, I have tried to resolve. So he talked about, the cost of living. He also talked about transparency and accountability in governance in terms of having CSs now, having question time in Parliament. But he also mentioned, the words that he'd said about the official opposition, having a position in Parliament that would be fully funded, saying he had given that memorandum to Parliament. The one that had so far been resolved was the issue of CSs appearing before MPs to answer questions. He said, but for the other one, we will wait and see.
Right.
This is not the first time President Ruto has talked about issues like the official opposition. He's said it before. And you've also heard of similar things from Raila Odinga, particularly to do with the Constitution. So, you know, we're now talking about what the contents of, or the subject matter will be at the table with this 14-member team in total. But you still are hearing, you know, a few things on the side about what could possibly be added here. And there have been allusions to some changes in the Constitution, Sam.
Right. And I mean, listening to these leaders, you sort of get confused, because I remember speaking to Opiyo Wandayi, the leader of minority in the National Assembly, and him telling me that there has to be talks before the talks, then saying that we have to have terms of reference. And I asked him, so from where? He said that they have to come from the leaders on both coalitions. So I asked him, so are you saying that you want those terms of reference to come from President Ruto and Raila Odinga? He said there are different cadres of leadership in those two sides of politics. But you get the feeling that, because yes, President Ruto already suggested certain areas that needed to be looked into in that memorandum to the two speakers of the House, of the two houses of Parliament. And you find that, obviously, if you're talking about amending a constitution to provide for the two-third gender rule, or you're amending the constitution to ensure that you're able to entrench the CDF, Kitty, the National Government Affirmative Action Fund, also the Senate Oversight Fund, there are several issues that those two leaders are aware that they need to be looked into. And actually, remember that William Ruto voted against the Constitution, campaigned against the Constitution, saying that there are certain areas that need to be looked into. Raila Odinga said 80% is good, but there's 20% that needs to be looked into. I remember speaking to him on the 18th of March this year.
Yeah.
And he was saying, yes, the Constitution has been with us for 13 years, so it is ripe for a review. There are certain things that we need to fix. He even said, had they not opposed the BBI, wouldn't be where we are. So it gives you that sense that, yes, there's a serious issue here of cost of living. There's a serious issue of how to reconstitute the IEBC selection panel. But you see, the selection panel, which you'll get into, has 7 members. Even if you reorganize who picks those 7 members, does it resolve all the political issues that Azimio coalition has? My guess is that it's a no. Therefore, there are several issues that we have not even spoken about yet. But if you look at the statement that came from the Azimio side today, they speak to that. And they say that there's also a conversation that has to happen when it comes to, let me just get that right, that you need a proper constitutional review to cure the governance defects in the 2010 Constitution and remove the last vestiges of an imperial presidency. That is not a conversation that was on the streets last week. But this, for it to be, there has to be a proper conversation between especially President William Ruto and Raila Odinga. Yeah,
and I think there's a bit of that we heard. Maybe if, as a country, we were listening, there was all of these things that were coming in. You spoke with Raila Odinga, I think it was on the eve of the protest, right? I wonder if we can listen to some of those, because he talked about tunataka mabadiliko ya katiba, you know, and the one you were talking about, had they not opposed BBI and the constitutional review. So these things have been sort of, you know, said. And then, you know, on the mass protests, you know, it's the cost of living and that sort of thing. But let's listen to those two.
Sisi kama wanaazimio, si waenda wazimu, si wajinga, lakini Wakenya wazalendo. Tunataka Kenya ibadilike. Tunataka Wakenya wasiheshimiwe, waishi maisha ya heshima. Tumesema tunataka mabadiliko ya kikatiba. Tunataka vile saba ipunguliwe.
You remember, the problem we're having right now would not be existing if they had agreed to allow us to have the BBI. But they opposed BBI. Now they want to introduce it through the back door. And you're saying, no, if you want a BBI now, then let's just go back to the people. Just look at the Constitution holistically and see where we need an amendment. You know, we passed this Constitution 13 years ago. So it is really now time to do a review of it and to see what is working, what is not working. Okay? We are ready to engage. as a team, as Azimio.
And, you know, that's a reminder that this was on the eve of the very first protest, right? Yeah.
2 days before.
2 days before. So you can see that there's been certain hints at what this might be. Of course, the Kenya Kwanza side is saying there will be no handshake, there will be no such discussion, but narrowing it down. So here we are again at some sort of stalemate. Alinas, just before we go into the break?
What we expect to see is a mutation and evolution of the issues. And I think what the president did on Sunday is to open a window. And after this, you never know what goes in. Because you just need to look at the events of the last few days. It started off as a Kenya Kwanza, Azimio. And the president makes it clear it's bipartisan, it's parliamentary, go to parliament. And that is his position up to today. If you look at the last few days, we've had interesting press conferences. We've had church leaders saying, no, we want a process that is inclusive.
Multi-sectoral.
Multi-sectoral. Inclusive of who? That was not what was said on Sunday. That was not the indication of things on Sunday. And then just today, we saw some of the other political parties saying, we too need to be involved in this conversation. So that should give us an indication as to where this is going. It'll be very, very interesting to see what happens on day one when the 7-7 teams meet, because obviously, definitely, there'll be an issue of now setting the agenda. And back to the point Jamila was making earlier about the terms, that is part of this process. When you're going into conflict resolution, you have to set the terms. You have to agree on what is the scope. And then you have to isolate the issues. So it's going to be a long process. It's not one of these things that we expect, these sound bites that are coming out of political rallies, some which have absolutely no bearing on what is going to happen next week or even thereafter. But I think what we should read into the rallies, and we've seen the president and his team today going into rally mode, basically, in addressing their supporters in between the events. The message was, we are not ceding ground to those guys. We won this election. They want to come into government through the back door. We will not allow that. Of course, that's the message you give to your supporters. But then there are some certain substantive issues that then you will have to confront. What do you want to go for in these negotiations? Both sides do have certain things that they specifically want to go for when it comes to the constitutional structure and the legal framework of this country. There are things they want to either tinker with, change, remove. We saw the other day in one of the Kenya Kwanza events, people asking for a county. Did you see that? I think somewhere in Migori County. We want our own county. Now, we are not in the old days where the president can stand and say...
And carve out a district.
Kwanzia sai nyinyi ni district. Kama nyinyi ni county. You know, it used to be that simple. Now, when you make a promise or when you entertain a conversation like that, then you must be prepared to go the long route, which is, can we reopen the constitution and look at the number of counties and see how we can accommodate this and that? So what we're saying is this is going to be a very long conversation. It will take a lot of time, just like the previous conversations have been. Now, there's some worry about what we are calling extremists and hardliners. I'd be careful not to call anybody a hardliner.
Why?
Because that is their position. Hardline against what? That is where they stand. They stand with, we won the election, accept and take your position in the opposition benches. What is hardline about that? There will be hardening of positions. We can start talking of hardliners when the negotiations proper begin. Because hardliners over what? They just Kenya Kwanza.
The terms of reference haven't been set.
The terms of reference and the issues have not been... You know, hardliners now emerge when the issues which come to the center, the middle, that should attract both sides to a solution. It's when we have people pulling away from that then we can identify and say, hey, these ones are hardliners because they are not accepting that position. We don't have hardliners yet. We just have two parties that are still very bitter about a closely contested election that they had. Because let's remember that I think this is the closest election we've had. It's even closer compared to the 2007 election, which had about a difference of about 300,000 or so votes. This one was about 200,000. And it had, I mean, we had a lot of people that did not vote. So it's not really a mandate that was that clear. So, and these two sides, and remember the atmosphere of the campaign was very, very toxic, and these guys became absolute enemies. So they are not yet hardliners. They are holding to their pre-election positions. Okay. Let's see when the issues are isolated, when it emerges what it is that people want out of the bipartisan process, and when it emerges what it is that the players do want. Because let's be clear, President William Ruto and Raila Odinga, who will not be members of the bipartisan process in any way, except externally, also do have an interest in the outcome of both the bipartisan process. And if they can't get what they want through the bipartisan process, we predict here on this desk that they'll be the first ones to switch gears to the next thing, which is expanding the process. Okay, and you know, one of the issues that is on the table, at least so far, is IEBC and the selection of the new commissioners. However, there was an IEBC selection panel that was already in place and set to begin the process. In fact, you know, we'll get into that. They already took in applications and they were ready to now move to the next stage. What happens to that process now that there's this bipartisan one? And what is the issue with that selection panel to begin with? We'll talk about that when we come back. This is NewsGang.